Jake Mitchell stepped off the Greyhound bus and took a deep breath of the familiar air. Oak Valley looked exactly the same as when he left 6 years ago. The same old diner with the faded red sign, the same gas station with the cracked pavement, and the same dusty main street that seemed frozen in time. But Jake wasn't the same man who had left this small town as an eager young soldier. His right leg throbbed as he shifted, his weight a constant reminder of that terrible day in Afghanistan. When everything changed? The doctors had done their best, but the shrapnel from the roadside bomb had left him with a permanent limp and pain that never really went away. He grabbed his worn duffel bag and started walking toward the old pickup truck where his wife, Lisa, was waiting. Lisa's smile was bright, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. She had been holding down 2 part-time jobs while he was recovering in the military hospital, and the medical bills were piling up despite his veteran benefits. They had talked on the phone about his plans to come home and start fresh, but both of them knew it wouldn't be easy. "How was the ride, honey?" Lisa asked as she hugged him carefully, mindful of his injuries. "Long," Jake replied with a tired smile, "but it's good to be home." The drive to their small rental house was quiet. Jake looked out the window at the farmland stretching for miles, remembering how he used to dream of traveling the world when he was stuck in this place. Well, he had certainly seen more of the world than he ever wanted to. 3 tours in Afghanistan had shown him things that still visited him in his dreams. Their house was smaller than Jake remembered, with a front porch that sagged a little in paint that was starting to peel. But it was home, and right now, that's all that mattered. Lisa had put a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree in the front yard, and seeing it made Jake's chest tighten with emotion. Over the next few weeks, Jake tried to settle back into civilian life. He applied for jobs at the hardware store, the auto repair shop, and even the grocery store. Each time, the interviews seemed to go well until he mentioned his military service and his injury. Then the smiles would fade and he'd get the same response: "We'll call you if something opens up." The truth was, people in Oak Valley didn't really know what to do with veterans like Jake. They'd shake his hand and thank him for his service, but when it came to actually hiring him, there were always excuses. "Insurance concerns," they'd say. Or, "We need someone who can be on their feet all day." Jake had earned medals during his time in the service, a Distinguished Service Cross and a Purple Heart that now sat in a shoebox in his closet. But those medals didn't pay the bills or make his leg hurt any less. Sometimes he wondered if they meant anything at all in the real world. The nightmares didn't help either. Jake would wake up in a cold sweat, thinking he was back in that convoy when the bomb went off. Lisa would hold him until the shaking stopped, but he could see how much it worried her. The VA counselor had told him this was normal, that many veterans struggled with what they called PTSD, but knowing it was normal didn't make it any easier to live with. Money was getting tight. Lisa's jobs at the diner and the local laundromat barely covered their basic expenses, and Jake's disability payments weren't enough to make up the difference. They had already fallen behind on rent twice, and their landlord was starting to make pointed comments about finding more reliable tenants. That's when Jake heard about the job opening at Sunset Ranch. It was owned by a wealthy businessman named Mr. Carson, who had made his money in real estate and construction. The ranch was more of a hobby for him, a place where he could play cowboy on the weekends and impress his city friends with his authentic rural lifestyle. The job didn't pay much, just $8 an hour for hard manual labor. It was well below minimum wage, but Mr. Carson claimed it was contract work and somehow got away with it. Jake knew he was being taken advantage of, but he needed the work desperately. His first day at Sunset Ranch was a reality check. Mr. Carson was a man in his 50s who wore expensive cowboy boots that had never seen real work in a hat that looked like it came straight from a Hollywood costume department. He walked around the ranch like he owned the world, which, in this small corner of it, he basically did. "So, you're the veteran," Mr. Carson said when Jake introduced himself. There was something in his tone that Jake didn't like, not respect or gratitude, but almost disappointment, like he had expected someone different. "Yes, sir, Army. Just got back from Afghanistan," Jake replied. Standing as straight as his injured leg would allow, Mr. Carson looked him up and down. his eyes lingering on Jake's slight limp. "Well, I hope you can keep up. This isn't the military, where you get special treatment. Here, if you can't do the job, you don't get paid." The other ranch hands were a mix of local guys who couldn't find better work and a few migrant workers who spoke little English. They seemed nice enough, but Jake could tell they were all afraid of losing their jobs. In a town like Oak Valley, work was hard to come from, and Mr. Carson knew it. Jake's assignments were always the hardest ones, while other workers got to drive the tractors or do maintenance work. Jake found himself mucking out stalls, hauling heavy feed bags, and doing whatever dirty job Mr. Carson could think of. His leg would be screaming in pain by the end of each day, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. "That's what happens when you come back broken," Mr. Carson would say loudly enough for others to hear. "The government trains you to fight, but they can't fix you when you come back all messed up." Jake never responded to these comments. He needed the job too badly to risk losing it over his pride. But each cruel remark cut deeper than Mr. Carson probably realized. This wasn't how Jake had imagined his homecoming would be every night. Jake would drag himself home, shower off the day's dirt and sweat, and try to pretend everything was fine when Lisa asked how work went. But she could see the hurt in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged a little more each day. This wasn't the life Jake had dreamed of when he enlisted. He had wanted to serve his country, to make a difference, to come home as a hero. Instead, he was cleaning up after horses for a man who seemed to take pleasure in reminding him how worthless he had become. But Jake Mitchell was a survivor. He had made it through 3 tours in Afghanistan, survived an explosion that should have killed him, and earned medals for bravery that most people would never understand. He could survive this too, even if right now it didn't feel that way. Little did Jake know, his story was far from over. Sometimes the darkest moments come right before the dawn. 3 weeks into working at Sunset Ranch, Jake's alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 in the morning. His leg was already aching before his feet hit the floor, but he knew Mr. Carson expected him there by 5 sharp. The ranch owner had made it clear that being a veteran didn't earn Jake any special treatment. In fact, it seemed to make things worse. "Morning, soldier boy," Mr. Carson would greet him with that smirk that made Jake's stomach turn. "Hope you're ready for some real work today. Not like that make-believe stuff you did overseas." Jake bit his tongue and nodded. He needed this job, no matter how much it hurt his pride. Lisa had been up late again the night before, going through their bills with a calculator, her face tight with worry. The rent was due in a week, and they were still short. The other ranch hands had learned to avoid Jake when Mr. Carson was around. Tommy, a local guy who'd been working the ranch for 2 years, had tried to stick up for Jake once. Mr. Carson had sent him home without pay that day and told him not to bother coming back if he was going to cause trouble. After that, everyone kept their heads down and stayed quiet when the boss started in on Jake. Mr. Carson seemed to have an endless supply of cruel comments. While Jake was cleaning out the pig pen, bent over in the mud and filth, Carson would bring visitors by just to point him out. "That's what they call a war hero these days," he'd say loud enough for Jake to hear. "Can't even hold down a real job, so we have to give him charity work." The worst part wasn't even the words, it was the way Mr. Carson's friends would laugh. Rich men from the city who came to the ranch for weekend hunting trips and business meetings. They'd stand there in their clean clothes and expensive watches, chuckling at Jake like he was some kind of entertainment. Jake had always been strong, even after his injury. But Mr. Carson made sure to give him tasks that would push him to his limits, hauling 100-pound feed sacks up to the loft when his leg was already screaming, moving heavy equipment by hand when there was a perfectly good tractor sitting right there, cleaning the septic tanks on the hottest days of summer. "If you can't handle it, just say so," Mr. Carson would taunt when he saw Jake struggling. "I'm sure there's a nice desk job somewhere for broken-down soldiers like you. Maybe greeting people at the discount store." By the end of each day, Jake could barely walk. He'd limp to his old pickup truck, every step sending sharp pains up his leg. The drive home was torture, pressing the clutch and brake with his injured leg. Sometimes he had to pull over and wait for the worst of the pain to pass, Lisa would have dinner waiting, but Jake rarely had much appetite. She'd watch him push food around his plate, her own dinner getting cold while she worried about her husband. She'd seen the medals in that shoebox and knew Jake had done something important in the war, but he never talked about it. The man who came home was so different from the confident young soldier who had left. "Maybe you should look for something else," Lisa suggested one evening, watching Jake rub his aching leg. "There has to be other work somewhere." Jake shook his head. "I've tried everywhere, at least this pays something." But they both knew $8 an hour wasn't really enough to live on. Even in a small town like Oak Valley, the nightmares were getting worse too. Jake would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, thinking he was back in Afghanistan. But now, instead of dreaming about the explosion that hurt his leg, he was having dreams about Mr. Carson standing over him, laughing while Jake struggled to get up from the dirt. During the day, Jake found himself jumping at loud noises. When a truck backfired in the ranch yard, he hit the ground so hard he scraped his palms raw. The other workers stared at him like he was crazy, and Mr. Carson just shook his head in disgust. "Great, now I've got a head case working for me," Carson muttered. "This is exactly why I don't like hiring you military types. You're all messed up in the head." Jake wanted to explain that it wasn't that simple, that what happened to him in the war wasn't something he could just turn off. But Mr. Carson wasn't interested in explanations. He was only interested in making Jake feel small, the breaking point. Came on a hot Tuesday in July. Mr. Carson was hosting some important business partners from Dallas, men in expensive suits who were considering investing in one of his development projects. Jake was working in the horse stable, cleaning stalls and putting down fresh hay when he heard voices approaching. "Let me show you the authentic ranch experience," Mr. Carson was saying to his guests. "We keep it real here, none of that fake Hollywood nonsense." Jake tried to stay focused on his work, hoping they'd walk by without stopping. But of course Mr. Carson had other plans. "Hey, soldier," Carson called out. "Come over here and meet some important people." Jake straightened up, brushing hay off his work shirt. He was covered in dirt and sweat, and he could smell the horses and manure on his clothes. The business partners were looking at him with barely concealed disgust. "This here is Jake," Mr. Carson announced with that familiar smirk. "He's one of our special employees. Government trained him to be a killer, but now he's learning useful skills like cleaning up after animals." One of the men chuckled uncomfortably. Another whispered something to his companion. Jake felt his face burning with shame, but he stood there and took it, just like he always did. "Jake here has some fancy medals at home," Carson continued, really warming up now. "Purple Heart, some other shiny things. But medals don't teach. You how to work, do they, Jake?" "No, sir," Jake managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "See, this is what's wrong with our country," Carson said, turning to his guests like Jake wasn't even there. "We spend all this money training these boys to fight wars, but we don't teach them how to be useful when they come back. So guys like me have to take them on as charity cases, give them simple work they can actually handle." The words hit Jake like physical blows. Charity case. Simple work. All the pride he'd once felt in his service. All the sacrifice he'd made for his country. Reduced to this moment of public humiliation in front of strangers, who would go back to their comfortable lives and probably never think of him again. "I think we've seen enough of the facilities," one of the investors said, clearly uncomfortable with the display. "Perhaps we could discuss the numbers back at your office." As the group walked away, Jake heard Carson's voice carrying across the yard. "Don't worry about him. He's harmless. All bark and no bite these days." Jake stood there alone in the stable, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses, feeling like the smallest man in the world. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't the life he'd earned with his service and sacrifice, but unknown to everyone at that ranch, Jake Mitchell was carrying a secret that would change everything. That night, Jake sat on his back porch staring at the stars, trying to push away the memory of Mr. Carson's words. Lisa had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from her double shift at the diner. The house was quiet except for the crickets and the Distant sound of traffic on the highway. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was creased and faded from being carried in his wallet for years. The picture showed him in his army uniform, standing with his unit in Afghanistan. He looked so young then, so confident. The man in that photo had no idea what was coming. Most people in Oak Valley knew Jake had served 3 tours overseas. They knew he'd been wounded and came home with medals. But what they didn't know, what Jake had sworn never to tell, was the real story of what happened during his final mission. It was May 15th, 2018. Jake's unit was part of a special operations team working deep in Taliban territory. Their job was supposed to be simple: escort a convoy of humanitarian supplies to a remote village that had been cut off for months. The villagers were running out of food and medicine, and winter was coming. Jake wasn't supposed to be on that mission at all. He was scheduled to rotate home in just 2 weeks. But their team was shorthanded, and Jake volunteered to go. He had always felt a connection to the Afghan people they were trying to help. These weren't politicians or soldiers, they were families with children who needed food and medical care. The convoy left the base at dawn, 3 armored trucks, carrying supplies and a small security team. Jake was riding in the lead vehicle with his buddy Rodriguez and their commanding officer, Lieutenant Cooper. The plan was to reach the village by noon, distribute the supplies, and be back at base before dark, but the Taliban had other plans. Jake still remembered the exact moment everything went wrong. They were about 5 miles from the village when the first shots rang out. The attack came from 3 sides, a carefully planned ambush that had been weeks in the making. The Taliban had been watching the supply route, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first truck took a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade. Jake watched in horror as it flipped over and burst into flames. Rodriguez was screaming into the radio, calling for air support, but the nearest helicopter was 30 minutes away. They were on their own. Jake's training kicked in immediately. He grabbed his rifle and started returning fire, trying to give the other soldiers a chance to find cover. But there were too many attackers, and they had picked the perfect spot for an ambush, a narrow valley with high ridges on both sides. That's when Jake saw them. About 50 Afghan civilians running toward the convoy from the direction of the village, men, women, and children who had heard the gunfire and come to see what was happening. They were caught in the middle of the firefight, completely defenseless. "We've got civilians in the kill zone!" Jake shouted to Lieutenant Cooper. "We have to get them out of there." Cooper looked at the situation and shook his head. "There's too many Taliban fighters. We need to pull back and wait for air support." But Jake could see what was about to happen. The Taliban fighters on the ridge were repositioning their weapons, getting ready to fire down into the valley where the civilians were trapped. In a few minutes, dozens of innocent people would be killed. Jake made a decision that would change his life forever, without waiting for orders. He grabbed as much ammunition as he could carry and ran toward the civilians. Bullets were flying everywhere, kicking up dust and rocks around his feet. He could hear his fellow soldiers shouting at him to come back. But he didn't stop. Jake reached the first group of civilians, a family with 3 small children who were too scared to move. The mother was clutching her baby, tears streaming down her face. The father was trying to shield his other kids with his own body. "This way!" Jake yelled in the little bit of Arabic he had learned. "Follow me!" For the next 20 minutes, Jake made trip after trip between the civilians and a small cluster of rocks that offered some protection. He would run out under enemy fire, grab whoever he could, sometimes carrying children, sometimes helping wounded adults, and get them to safety. Each trip was more dangerous than the last. The Taliban fighters had figured out what he was doing and were concentrating their fire on him. A bullet grazed his shoulder. Another one went through his helmet. But Jake kept going back. On his 6th trip, Jake found Lieutenant Cooper badly wounded behind one of the burning trucks. A piece of shrapnel had hit him in the chest, and he was losing blood fast. Jake threw Cooper over his shoulder and carried him to the rocks where the civilians were hiding. "You're crazy, Mitchell," Cooper gasped. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe," Jake replied, already looking back at the valley. "But not today." By the time the helicopters finally arrived, Jake had saved 43 Afghan civilians and 12 American soldiers. But he paid a terrible price for his heroism. On his final trip, an improvised explosive device detonated just 20 feet away from him. The blast threw Jake 15 feet through the air. Shrapnel tore through his right leg, shattering bones and damaging nerves. For a moment, everything went black. When he woke up, the medics were working on him, and he could hear the helicopter rotors overhead. Jake spent the next 6 months in military hospitals, first in Germany and then in the United States. The doctors did everything they could, but his leg would never be the same. His military career was over. The medals came later. The Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism, the Purple Heart for being wounded in combat. But along with the medals came something else, a classification stamp that marked the entire mission as top secret. The military brass explained it to Jake in a windowless room at the hospital. The operation had been part of a larger intelligence-gathering effort. Revealing details about what happened could compromise other missions and put more lives at risk. Jake was ordered never to discuss the specifics of that day with anyone, not his family, not his friends, not even other veterans. "Your country owes you a debt it can never repay," the general had told him. But part of serving that country means carrying this burden in silence. So Jake signed the papers and took his oath of secrecy. When people asked him about his service, he would just say he'd been wounded in a roadside bombing. He never mentioned the civilians he'd saved or the soldiers who went home to their families because of what he'd done. Living with that secret was harder than living with his physical injuries. Every time someone thanked him for his service, Jake wanted to tell them what service really meant. Every time Mr. Carson called him worthless or broken, Jake wanted to scream about the lives he'd saved and the price he'd paid, but Jake kept his word. He kept the secret locked away in his heart, along with the faces of the children he'd carried to safety and the memory of Lieutenant Cooper, squeezing his hand before the helicopter took them away. Now, sitting on his porch in Oak Valley, Jake wondered if it had all been worth it. He had saved dozens of lives, but his own life seemed to be falling apart. The people he'd protected would never know his name, and the people in his hometown would never know what he'd really done. Jake folded up the old photograph and put it back in his wallet. Tomorrow he'd get up early and go back to the ranch, where Mr. Carson would find new ways to humiliate him. Because that was his life now, cleaning stalls and taking insults from a man who had never risked anything for anyone. But sometimes, late at night like this, Jake allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be a hero, even if no one else would ever know. It was a Tuesday morning in late August when Jake first noticed the black SUVs coming up the dusty road toward Sunset Ranch. He was mucking out the horse stalls, sweat dripping down his face despite the early hour. His leg was already aching from the work, but he tried to ignore it like he did every day. At first, Jake thought the vehicles might be more of Mr. Carson's business friends coming for another one of those meetings where they'd point and laugh at the broken soldier. But as the convoy got closer, something felt different. These weren't the flashy luxury cars that Carson's usual visitors drove. These were government vehicles, official-looking and serious, 3 black SUVs with tinted windows pulled into the ranch packing area and stopped in perfect formation. Jake leaned on his pitchfork and watched, curious but not too concerned. Whatever this was about, it probably had nothing to do with him. Mr. Carson came rushing out of the main house, straightening his expensive cowboy shirt and adjusting his hat. He loved it when important-looking people visited his ranch. It made him feel powerful and connected. Jake could see him from across the yard, putting on his biggest fake smile as he walked toward the vehicles. The doors of the lead SUV opened, and several people in military dress uniforms stepped out. Even from a distance, Jake could see the stars and ribbons on their uniforms. These were high-ranking officers, the kind of people Jake had only seen from far away during his time in the service. A woman with silver hair and general stars on her shoulders seemed to be leading the group. She was maybe 50 years old, with the kind of bearing that commanded respect even in civilian clothes. Behind her were two colonels, a major, and what looked like a couple of official photographers. Jake felt his stomach tighten. Military officials didn't usually make house calls unless something was seriously wrong. His first thought was that maybe someone he'd served with had died, and they were notifying next of kin. But why would they come to the ranch instead of his house? Mr. Carson was practically bouncing on his toes as he approached the group. Jake could see him talking and gesturing, probably bragging about his property and his important connections. The general listened politely but didn't seem particularly impressed with Carson's speech. Then something strange happened. The general pointed directly toward the horse stables where Jake was working. Mr. Carson's expression changed, and Jake could see him shaking his head and pointing toward the main house, like he was trying to redirect their attention somewhere else, but the general wasn't interested in whatever Carson was selling. She started walking toward the stables, and the rest of the military group followed. Mr. Carson hurried along beside them, talking rapidly and gesturing with his hands. Jake's heart started pounding. Whatever this was about, it was about him. He quickly tried to make himself more presentable, brushing hay off his work clothes and wiping the sweat from his forehead. But there wasn't much he could do. He was covered in dirt and horse manure, wearing torn jeans and an old t-shirt that had seen better days. As the group got closer, Jake could hear Mr. Carson's voice getting louder and more defensive. "I'm telling you, General, if Jake Mitchell is in some kind of trouble, I had no idea," Carson was saying. "The guy keeps to himself, doesn't talk much about his service. For all I know, he could have been lying about the whole thing." Jake felt his face burn with shame. Even now, even with military brass walking across his ranch, Carson couldn't resist taking shots at him. "He's been working for me for a few months," Carson continued. "Honestly, I felt sorry for him. Guy can barely walk straight, clearly got some problems from the war. I gave him simple work, stuff he could handle without messing up." The general stopped walking and turned to look at Carson with an expression that could have frozen. "Water." "Mr. Carson," she said, in a voice that was calm but carried the authority of someone used to commanding thousands of soldiers, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Jake dropped his pitchfork and tried to stand at attention, even though his leg made it difficult. Years of military training kicked in automatically. When a general approached, you showed respect, no matter what you were wearing or where you were standing. "Sergeant Mitchell?" the general said, and Jake's world tilted on its axis. It had been over 4 years since anyone had called him by his military rank. "Yes, ma'am," Jake managed to say, his voice barely steady. Mr. Carson was looking back and forth between them, his face showing confusion and growing worry. Wait, he said. "What's going on here? Is Jake in trouble or not?" The general ignored Carson completely and focused on Jake up close. He could see that her uniform was perfect, every ribbon and medal placed exactly where it should be. This was someone who had spent decades serving their country, someone who understood what sacrifice really meant. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, "my name is General Patricia Williams. I'm here representing the Department of the Army and the Pentagon." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His mouth felt dry and his hands were shaking slightly. The last time he'd been visited by military officials, this high-ranking was in the hospital when they'd sworn him to secrecy about his final mission. "I understand you've been working here at this ranch," General Williams continued, glancing around. "At the stables and the dirty work Jake had been doing." "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied. "Just trying to make a living." Mr. Carson stepped forward, still confused but starting to sense that maybe he'd been wrong about something. "General, I don't understand what's happening here. Jake is just a ranch hand. He cleans stalls and does odd jobs. I mean, I know he was in the Army, but..." General Williams turned to Carson with a look that made him take a step backward. "Mr. Carson, the man you have cleaning stalls is one of the most decorated soldiers of his generation." The words hung in the air like thunder. Jake felt his knees go weak, and he had to grip the fence post to stay upright. After 4 years of silence, after being sworn to secrecy, after keeping the most important moment of his life locked away in his heart, someone was finally going to tell the truth. Carson's face went pale. What do you mean?" "What I mean," General Williams said, her voice getting stronger, "is that this man saved the lives of 43 civilian non-combatants and 12 American soldiers in a classified operation in Afghanistan. What I mean is that Sergeant Mitchell is being considered for our nation's highest military honor." Jake felt tears starting to form in his eyes. He had carried this secret for so long, had endured so much humiliation and pain, that hearing someone finally acknowledge what he'd done felt like a dam bursting inside his chest. The other military officers stepped forward, forming a respectful semicircle around Jake. The photographers raised their cameras. Even the ranch hands who had been working nearby stopped what they were doing and gathered at a respectful distance. Mr. Carson stood there with his mouth open, looking like someone had just told him the earth was flat. His face was cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and what looked like growing horror as he realized what he'd been doing. General Williams reached into her jacket and pulled out an official-looking folder. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, "we're here because your mission has been declassified. The American people in the world are finally going to know what you did on May 15th, 2018. Jake's legs felt like they might give out completely. After all these years of silence, after all the nights he'd wondered if his sacrifice had meant anything, the truth was finally going to come out. And furthermore," General Williams continued, her voice carrying across the ranch yard, "we're here to inform you that you've been selected for induction into the Army's Hall of Heroes. Your actions on that day exemplify the very highest traditions of military service." The world seemed to stop spinning. Jake looked at Mr. Carson, who was now visibly sweating despite the morning coolness. He looked at the other ranch workers, who were staring at him like they'd never seen him before. He looked at General Williams, who was smiling at him with genuine warmth and respect. For 4 years, Jake had been just a broken-down veteran cleaning horse stalls for $8 an hour, but he was about to remember what it felt like to be a hero. General Williams opened the official folder and began reading from the document inside. Her voice carried across the ranch yard with the authority and respect that Jake hadn't heard directed toward him in years. On May 15th, 2018 in Kandahar, Province, Afghanistan, Sergeant Jake Mitchell displayed extraordinary heroism during a Taliban ambush on a humanitarian convoy, she began. Despite intense enemy fire and with complete disregard for his own safety, Sergeant Mitchell repeatedly exposed himself to hostile fire to rescue both American soldiers and Afghan civilians trapped in the kill zone. Jake could barely breathe. After 4 long years of keeping this secret, hearing it spoken aloud felt surreal. The ranch hands were gathering closer, their faces showing amazement and respect. These were the same men who had watched Mr. Carson humiliate him day after day. Too afraid to speak up, Mr. Carson looked like he was going to be sick. The color had completely drained from his face, and his hands were shaking. Jake could see him trying to process what he was hearing, trying to reconcile the worthless charity case he'd been tormenting with the war hero standing before him. General Williams continued reading. Sergeant Mitchell made 6 separate trips into the combat zone under heavy fire, personally evacuating 12 wounded American soldiers and 43 Afghan civilians, including women and children. His actions directly resulted in saving 55 lives. One of the colonels stepped forward and added, "The mission was classified for operational security reasons," which meant Sergeant Mitchell was unable to discuss his service record. He maintained that classification at great personal cost, even when it would have benefited him to reveal the truth. Jake felt tears rolling down his cheeks, and he didn't care who saw them. For so long, he had wondered if his sacrifice meant anything, if anyone would ever know what really happened that day in Afghanistan. Now, standing in the middle of a horse ranch in his dirty work clothes, he was finally being recognized for the most important thing he'd ever done. Sergeant Mitchell was wounded during his final rescue attempt, General Williams continued. An improvised explosive device detonated during his last trip to save a wounded comrade. Despite his severe injuries, he continued to provide covering fire until air support arrived. Tommy, one of the ranch hands, was staring at Jake with his mouth open. "Jesus," he whispered. "Jake, you saved all those people?" Jake nodded, still trying to absorb that this was really happening. I did what any soldier would do, he said quietly. No, General Williams corrected him firmly. You did what a hero does, and that's why we're here today. She turned to face the growing crowd of ranch workers and gestured for them to come closer. Even some of the neighbors had started gathering, drawn by the unusual sight of military vehicles and officials at Sunset Ranch. Ladies and gentlemen, General Williams announced in a voice that commanded everyone's attention, I want you to meet Staff Sergeant Jake Mitchell, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart, and as of today, inductee into the United States Army Hall of Heroes. The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, one of the ranch hands started clapping, then another. Within moments, everyone in the yard was applauding, and Jake could see tears in several people's eyes, but General Williams wasn't finished. She turned to the two colonels behind her and nodded. They stepped forward in perfect synchronization, removed their hats, and snapped to attention. All military personnel, General Williams called out clearly. Present arms. What happened next was something Jake had never expected to see again. Every soldier in the group came to crisp attention and rendered a perfect salute. The photographers captured the moment as 5 high-ranking military officers saluted Jake Mitchell, the ranch hand covered in dirt and hay. The symbolism was powerful and unmistakable. Here was a man who had been treated as worthless, saluted by some of the most important military leaders in the country. Jake straightened his shoulders as much as his injured leg would allow and returned the salute with as much pride and dignity as he could muster. Mr. Carson was backing away slowly, probably hoping he could slip away unnoticed. But General Williams wasn't done with him yet. Mr. Carson, she called out, causing him to freeze in place. I understand that Sergeant Mitchell has been working for you. Carson nodded nervously, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning cool. Yes, well, I was just trying to help. Giving a veteran a chance to work. General Williams studied Carson for a long moment. And how exactly were you helping him? Carson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Everyone in the yard was staring at him, waiting for his answer. The ranch hands who had witnessed his daily cruelty toward Jake were looking at him with disgust and shame. I gave him a job, Carson stammered. Honest work. For $8 an hour, Tommy spoke up suddenly, his voice filled with anger. Making him do the hardest jobs while you called him names and treated him like garbage. Other voices joined in. The ranch hands who had been too scared to defend Jake before were now finding their courage. They told General Williams about the daily humiliations, the impossible tasks, the cruel comments made in front of visitors. General Williams listened to it all with an expression that grew colder by the minute. When the stories finished, she turned back to Carson. Mr. Carson, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You've been paying a decorated war hero below minimum wage to clean your stables while you mock his service and his injuries. Carson tried to speak, but no words came out. Furthermore, General Williams continued, you did this while knowing he was a Purple Heart recipient who was wounded defending our country. I didn't know, Carson finally managed to whisper. He never told me about any missions or heroes or anything like that. Because he wasn't allowed to, one of the colonels said sharply. He was bound by classification restrictions. He kept his oath of secrecy even when it cost him personally. Jake watched this all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. After months of humiliation, seeing Mr. Carson squirm under the disapproving gaze of military brass felt like justice finally being served. General Williams reached into her jacket and pulled out another document. Sergeant Mitchell, the Army has been following your situation. We're aware that you've had difficulty finding appropriate employment since your discharge. She handed him the paper. I'm pleased to offer you a position as a training instructor. At Fort Bragg's Special Operations School, you'd be teaching combat tactics and leadership to our next generation of Special Forces soldiers. Jake stared at the document, unable to believe what he was reading. A real job, a good job. Doing something that mattered, something that used his skills and experience. The salary is $68,000 annually, plus full medical benefits. And housing allowance? General Williams added. Jake heard someone gasp and realized it was him. That was more money than he and Lisa had made combined in the past 2 years. The ceremony continued for another hour. The photographers took dozens of pictures. Local news crews arrived after someone called them. By noon, Jake Mitchell was no longer an unknown ranch hand. He was a local hero, a decorated war veteran whose story was spreading across social media and news outlets. Mr. Carson quietly slipped away during the commotion, but the damage to his reputation was already done. Within days, several of his business partners canceled their contracts. The investors from Dallas pulled out of his development deal. Word spread quickly in their small community about how he had treated a war hero, and decent people wanted nothing to do with him. Jake drove home that afternoon in a daze. Lisa was waiting on the front porch, having heard the news from 3 different neighbors. She ran to him before he even got out of the truck, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered as she held him tight. "I always knew you were a hero." That evening, Jake sat on the same back porch where he'd spent so many nights wondering if his sacrifice had meant anything. But tonight was different. Tonight he knew that it had. The medals in the shoebox upstairs finally meant something again. His phone had been ringing all day with job offers, interview requests, and congratulations from people he hadn't heard from in years. The whole town wanted to honor him now, to claim him as their own. But the best part wasn't the recognition or the new job or even seeing Mr. Carson get what he deserved. The best part was the way Lisa looked at him now, not with worry or pity, but with the same love and pride she'd had when he first left for the Army all those years ago. Jake Mitchell was finally home.